Good morning. My name is Pablo Marina, and I'm the Global Head of Health and Wellness at BANCO Santander. Throughout the pandemic, one of the greatest challenges was to understand the evolution of the COVID virus and of the disease itself. We all had to make decisions based on limited information and with a significant level of uncertainty. Indeed, going forward, we still have several critical questions for which the answers are not fully clear. To help us with them, we have the privilege of counting with Sir Jeremy Farrar. Dr. Farrar is one of the world's leading experts in infectious diseases. For 18 years, he was leading Oxford University's clinical research unit at the Hospital for Tropical Diseases in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. Through his work, Dr. Farrar made pivotal advances in the understanding and treatment of such diseases as tuberculosis, malaria, influenza, or dengue. Since 2013, Dr. Farrar is the director of the Wellcome Trust, one of the world's largest, most relevant independent charitable foundations focused on finding solutions for today's most urgent health challenges. At the same time, Dr. Farrar is a member of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies for the UK government, as well as for other global institutions such as the World Health Organization. Jeremy, good morning, and thanks for being with us today.
It's great to be here. It's my first banking conference.
Great. Let me take a couple of steps back and let's take a look at the process leading to COVID. We have had, in the last 2 decades, a number of different pandemics, SARS, MERS, H1N1. What did we miss? What lessons did we not learn properly out of those pandemics?
It was actually very interesting listening to the great panel earlier and the focus of the conference on climate change, because I think there are many similarities in these discussions and debates, and perhaps I'll pick out 2, 3 maybe. The first one is take warnings seriously. Warnings are telling you what's coming. And over the last 20 years, in fact, I've been involved in very many of them, going back to an outbreak in Malaysia that few people will remember called Nipah virus, now endemic in Bangladesh, all the way through, and I was very involved in SARS-1, in Ebola, in Zika, in Central and South America, in the pandemic of 2009. The world had many warnings every few years of a national or regional problem which could have become global. And we chose not to heed those warnings. And I think climate has many analogies to that. The second is that what you have before a crisis largely determines your ability to respond in a crisis. If you're trying to create structures and systems and critically trust in society in a crisis, you will always be too slow. And the third one is that crises lift a lid on inequalities. When we say nicely, we're all in this together, that is not the truth. The truth is crises of all types highlight inequalities between societies and within societies. So I think those, for me, are the 3 lessons. Take warning seriously. Invest in those things that you will need in good times and bad times. And lastly, address the issues of inequalities because they will be magnified in a crisis.
On a positive note, how did those pandemics help us on science and on policy to be better prepared for this one, particularly around the extraordinary effort done to develop COVID vaccines?
Well, COVID vaccines have changed this pandemic. We should not underestimate the impact of vaccination. In the UK at the moment, 1 in 45 people today is infected. 1 in 45 people. That is a staggering statistic. If we did not have vaccines, the whole of the health system in the UK would have collapsed. In Spain, you have done remarkably well here in Spain. You have, I think, touching over 80% of a whole population, and you have over 90% of people over the age of 18 vaccinated. A remarkable achievement. Without those vaccines, the transmission of this virus would have led to unacceptable rates of illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. So the vaccines have been incredible. They don't exist on their own. They exist with diagnostic testing, with treatments, with access to oxygen, and personal protective equipment. But they didn't come out by chance. The idea that we developed a vaccine in 10 months is a lovely story, but it's also not true. We had those vaccines in 2020 because of investments over 10, 20, 30 years in fundamental science, in small companies, BioNTech in Europe, Moderna in the United States. We had investments in those long term. We had vaccines for Middle East respiratory syndrome, a very similar virus in the Middle East, come from camels. We had putative vaccines for SARS. It's because of that investment in science in all of our societies that led to the fact that we could then make the vaccines in 10 months. And finally, on the vaccines, and I think this was also very important to the climate debate, we had a regulatory framework that was willing to support innovation and move faster than it would normally do in a non-crisis time. And what that showed to me is regulation can be innovative as well. Regulation does not need to be an impediment to innovation. It can be a facilitator of innovation. And I think that has ramifications beyond my area of science into other, maybe even to the banking world.
We have seen all through the pandemic issues in the processes with the countries. What have we learned about the way countries cooperate on pandemic preparedness and response, and also the role of global institutions like the World Health Organization?
So I think when you go through a crisis like this, it's also really important to not romanticize what happened. If I look at today in the world, we are in a very fragmented, polarized, geopolitically driven world, which is exposing the world at the moment to enormous risks. The cooperation between the West and East, with China, with the US, with Europe at the moment, has all but stopped. That means that we have no sight outside China, but in other jurisdictions as well. We have no sight of what viruses are circulating in the animal kingdom at the moment, what viruses may be coming across into humans, and which may be causing minor epidemics that we are just not noticing. Unless we address the issue of geopolitical international cooperation, we are putting the world at great risk. If that goes on for 6 months, if that goes on for a year, there is a risk. If we allow this to go on for 5 years, and we look back in the last 20 years and know that was an epidemic starting every 2 or 3 years, and we have no sight of that, then we will, I'm afraid, be setting already the precedent for the next pandemic. So whilst we have worked together in some ways, particularly in the rich world, we have left the developing world short of vaccines. Some countries, only 1% of access to vaccines today. And we have closed off the international cooperation that is so critical to keeping the world safe. So international cooperation at some level between mostly the rich world, mostly the West, has been exceptional. But for much of the world, that has not been true. And that will make addressing all of the great challenges of the 21st century, from climate change to drug resistance, to inequality, to energy access, to water access, far, far more difficult if we create a world of fragmentation and haves and have-nots. Mm-hmm. So what we do coming through and beyond the current phase of the pandemic will largely, I think, determine how we're able to address the great challenges of the 21st century.
And is the road to that, to achieving that, is it a question of information sharing and having a stable financial resourcing for the countries, or is there anything else?
It is more than that. I was very involved in SARS-1 and bird flu in Southeast Asia, and at that time the Indonesian Minister of Health, who later suffered from some of her own problems, but at the time she made a point which in 2004 has never been answered, and that is, as Indonesia, why should we share information with the rest of the world if all you'll do is sell us back a vaccine we can't afford? And if we are to get true sharing of information, we have to reduce the geopolitical tensions, and we have to both add the benefits of data sharing with the benefits that accrue from sharing that data. And I'm afraid the current inequality to access to vaccines is making that very difficult for the future. And as I say, I think that will bedevil our ability to bring consensus to COP26. I think it'll bedevil our ability to address pandemics for the future somehow. And you do this after crisis. You did this in the 20th century after crisis. Somehow we have to defuse this fragmentation, the tensions, the geopolitics, and say that the biggest lesson from COVID is that the world is very small. And what happens in Wuhan in December 2020 will impact the whole world within days or weeks. And that is, for me, the biggest single lesson. And at the heart of that is the willingness to work across borders, cooperate, and share information, but then share the benefits of sharing that information.
Indeed, if we take a look at the world today, there are many countries yet that have not had access to vaccines, below 25% vaccinations, some of them even below 10. What should be the right way to approach the distribution of vaccines, and in general terms, the distribution of special medicines in situations like the one we have gone through?
We should also pay tribute to what has happened in a positive. Never before has the world produced billions of doses of vaccines and given to every single age group across the world. It has never happened. Smallpox would be one example in the past, but never at this scale and this speed. So there is a lot to celebrate that if you'd said to me, even a year ago, but certainly 18 months ago, we would have incredibly safe and incredibly effective vaccines that you could manufacture at scale and give to billions of people in 2021 and reduce the impact of this pandemic. I would have jumped with joy. We couldn't have assumed that 18 months ago. And yet now we have the problem that vaccine access is very, very inequitable. These are true global public goods. They are enlightened self-interest. The biggest risk to the rich world today is that transmission goes on at a very high level in any jurisdiction, but particularly in the large population countries of particularly the developing world. And that out of that high transmission comes a new variant, a new mutation that comes back to America, to Europe, to everywhere, and escapes from the vaccines. That is the biggest risk, that we go back to a period of 2020. The way to address that is to drive down transmission everywhere and to make vaccines available. So this is perhaps in the 21st century, the best example of global public goods that need to be available to everybody, as a moral and ethical argument, as a financial and economic argument, but also out of enlightened self-interest. And we will get there, I believe. We'll get there in the first half of 2022. What we need to do for the future is get there within 100 days. And that should be our target for this decade.
Let me ask you for another of the key challenges that we have seen. Even in well-prepared countries, we had often seen how policymakers and governments were not really prepared for some of the big calls they had to make. It's a topic of special freedoms. There's also a topic, as you've mentioned before, of sharing, of opening doors to information, of sharing vaccines. Another big calls that should be made in order to give a global solution to this pandemic. How should we address that going forward? Other pandemics will come, we know it. How should we address this situation going forward?
So really, I think at the heart of what you're talking about is trust. And trust over the last 10 or 20 years has been stretched in many, many, many countries. I have to say I've been very critical, particularly of one government's decision-making in 2020. But I also admit and would acknowledge how difficult some of these decisions were. We talk about, my Spanish is awful, but the word lockdown was not a word that any of us knew what it meant 18 months ago. The fact that societies in the main, look at everybody here in this room, everybody, apart from us too, are wearing a mask. if you'd said to me 18 months ago, the whole of Europe would be willing to put a mask on when they went in the public transport, in the workplace, that they would be willing to be locked down at home, I would have been staggered that society would have done this without societal conflict and other things. It's been remarkable, actually, how much society has accepted. Here again, in Spain, 80 or 90% of people being willing to accept a vaccine that they knew was developed at breakneck speed. So I think within the concerns about the debates around trust, we should also remember there have been very many positives as well. And learn from those positives, but also learn from those negatives. And again, as with capacity that I talked about earlier, you cannot build trust in a crisis. The UK actually has also had very good vaccine uptake, but before the crisis, before COVID, the UK had some of the highest trust in vaccination across Europe and was able actually to roll out the vaccine without actually having to mandate it. And as a public health person, I'm much more in favour of trying to persuade people of the benefits of public health than having to mandate the demand for public health. I think you can get to higher rates of societal acceptance by persuasion, by communication, by education, than you can be mandating. And whilst we focus on politicians, and I just said this in a coffee break to Anna, nobody should underestimate where trust comes from. In modern world, with so much social media, trust in the main, if you look at the Edelman Trust Index, comes from your peers, your friends, your family, your colleagues, and critically your employer. So companies have got an absolutely critical role in building trust, in being a trusted place where information can flow, not from a commercial and financial perspective, not from a business or profits motive, but purely as a conduit of information to your employers, their families, their wider networks. That is where a lot of trust can be built. And I think one of the pleas that we would like to work with in the future is how better can we work with employers to address issues like COVID, but in future also things like mental health and indeed climate change. The relationship between the employer and the employee, I think, is one that we neglect in terms of building trust in society.
Jeremy, moving on to a topic, people participating today or watching us might not be aware that in developing countries, in developed countries like Spain or the UK, average life expectancy in the 1920s was 40 years of age, largely due to the impact of infectious diseases. In just 100 years, we've managed to move that from 40 to 80. And it's arguable, but very clear, that the role of vaccines has been key for that process to happen. And yet, we still see countries in which the anti-vaccine movement is very prominent, and we still see countries in which the amount of people that does not want to get a vaccine goes between 30 and 50%. What have we done wrong? How did we, what things did we not explain properly regarding vaccines effectiveness, how communication or education should have worked for this not to happen?
I think context is so important. If you go back to my parents' generation, who my father was born in 1917, my mother in 1923. That generation saw many of their siblings, brothers and sisters, dying in their mothers in childbirth, or their siblings dying in the first few years of life. The development, I would put vaccines and public health together. It's not just, vaccines are crucial, but it's also about sanitation. It's about improving housing. It's about reducing inequalities in all of our societies. But the progress in the, if you like, the human condition has been nothing short of staggering. I would argue that science has played a role in that, and culture. Science as part of culture. Economic growth, speaking to a banking conference, has been very important. If you don't have economic growth, you can't afford the vaccines that are critical or the improvements in public health. So all of this, and avoiding conflict, is the key issues, I think, for the 21st century. But we cannot take that for granted. We cannot take those advances of the last 50, 60, 70 years, my generation, for granted. If we start to assume that they would happen anyway, without buying into it as individuals, as communities, as companies or philanthropy, if we don't buy into the fact that it's our actions that make a difference, not our passivity, it's not just the absence of illness, it's because we're stopping illnesses. And one of the things I think we will have to shift in the next generation is how we turn health into prevention, because we cannot afford the costs of total health care. So where vaccines went before, we will have to focus on vaccines, but we'll also have to focus on other preventative measures that stop people getting sick. And there may be one or two positive things come out of COVID if we learn some lessons. And one of those is that infectious diseases will never go away, that vaccines are critical, but vaccines are part of a broader public health intervention. And we need all of those interventions that I've talked about if we're really going to improve not just the quantity of life, but also its quality.
How do we address that with the public? Is it, you mentioned right before this question that you're a proponent for an approach that convinces people of using the means rather than mandate those. Do we have the possibility of not establishing mandates in situations like this one?
I think you have to have the final preserve of mandates, but the best is to persuade people. And I think we have to get better at that. We have to be, yes, less arrogant. We have to come out of ivory towers and not just try and argue, but also persuade. The media, I think, is very important. And actually, although there's been a lot of criticism, I would say actually much of the media actually has been a very positive impact during much of the pandemic of 2020 and 2021. And this starts at a very early stage. One of the major things we do as a philanthropic organization is, of course, investing 1.6 billion a year euros in science, but it's also putting science and innovation together, and also putting science and innovation in the context of societies in which it operated. If you take science and innovation outside the societies that allow it to thrive, then you don't be surprised when societies don't wish to accept the science that you're offering. We have to try and bridge through education, through persuasion, through communications, and we have to get better at that in modern ways. We have to, in my view, bridge these three critical elements of science, innovation, and society, and put that in the cultural context that societies operate in. I would be actually far more optimistic on this than many. Yes, in some communities, the anti-vaccine movement, some people, the social media, but actually, I think they are less than we think. As I say, I go back again, 90% of people in Spain have been willing to accept a vaccine which was developed at breakneck speed. That tells you that actually society does and is willing to accept interventions such as that when there is a trust built up. In France, indeed, which France in 2019 had pretty low levels of acceptance of vaccines. Now, the French government has taken a more mandated approach to vaccines, a vaccine passport, but vaccine uptake in France is high. So whilst we shouldn't ignore the people that are anti-science, we shouldn't forget that throughout history there have been people that have been anti-science. It's for science to make the case for society rather than thinking society must accept the scientific arguments.
We're approaching the end of the conversation. Let me ask you for an effort on perspective. If we go ahead 20 years, how will we look back on COVID?
Let's meet, Pablo, here in 20 years.
20 years, that's a commitment.
I will get my vaccines, I'll make sure my cholesterol's not very high, I'll run every day, and we'll meet in 20 years' time. Okay, so I think 20 years from now, the words came out this morning, I think, from James. There's a turning point. We all feel it in the world in many, many ways. And when you come out of a crisis, you have a choice. Go back to the 20th century and think of the choices that were made at times of crisis. What you mustn't do coming out of a crisis is prevent too romantic a sense that we all did well. You must stop, pause, and learn the lessons. And if you want to be different in 20 years' time, you can't keep doing the same things. You have to change. And what that means is, go back to what I said earlier, it means having international cooperation to appreciate whether on climate or pandemics, the world is very small. And if we fragment now into an east-west, north-south tension, we will not address the great challenges of the 21st century. We must, in my view, invest in science. We must make sure science is part of society. And we must make sure that through our politicians, through our employers, and yes, maybe through philanthropy, we build trust in that system. And we will use that, we will bank that, and then when a crisis inevitably does hit, we will be much better placed with the resilience that we need in order to respond to it better. That's the hope. The negative side, which we could also choose, is that we fragment. But if we fragment, we will not address the great challenges of the 21st century. That's our choice.
Jeremy, it was a pleasure to have you with us. Extremely insightful. Thanks a lot.